When I bought my farm 3 years ago, I thought I'd finally found my peaceful escape. No neighbors, no noise, no drama, just me, the open land, and a small rustic house I'd been dreaming of restoring. The property was everything I wanted. A few acres of rolling fields, a tree line at the back, and an old padlocked gate at the entrance. It was simple, private, and mine. But then the HOA president from the neighborhood next door, Karen, as I'll call her, showed up. At first, I thought she was just being neighborly. She introduced herself the day I was unloading the last of my moving boxes, giving me that overly cheerful smile that always feels just a little too forced. Karen explained that she was the president of the HOA from the nearby subdivision. She pointed vaguely toward the rows of cookie-cutter homes about half a mile away and said something about how we like to keep the neighborhood looking nice. I didn't think much of it. I smiled, nodded, and told her I wasn't part of the HOA since my property wasn't within their boundaries. She laughed, almost nervously, and said, "Oh, of course not. But, it's always good to be a good neighbor." That phrase would come up again later, and it would send shivers down my spine. But at the time, I chalked it up to small talk and went back to unpacking. A few weeks later, Karen reappeared. This time I was outside repairing the old gate. It's a heavy metal gate that swings across my driveway, and it had rusted over the years. It wasn't much to look at, but it did its job, keeping the property secure and giving me some much-needed privacy. I had just finished painting it when I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. Karen was standing there, smiling again, holding a plate of cookies. "I thought I'd bring you these," she said, handing them over. Just a little welcome gift. I thanked her and we chatted for a minute. Then, casually, she gestured toward the gate. She said, "some of the folks in our neighborhood were wondering why it's locked. It's such a shame to keep such a lovely piece of land all closed off like that." I raised an eyebrow. "Well, it's my private property," I said. "I like having my space." Her smile faltered for just a second, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, of course, I just meant that it's such a beautiful area. It's the kind of place people would love to take a walk or enjoy the view. As good neighbors." There it was again. Good neighbors. I laughed politely and said something vague about liking my privacy. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't happy with my answer. Before she left, she added, "If you ever want to make improvements to the property, the HOA has resources. We're always here to help." I didn't think much of it at the time. Karen was a little pushy, sure, but I figured that was just her personality. I didn't know yet that this was only the beginning. A few months went by without incident. I spent my days working on the farm, fixing up the house, and enjoying the quiet. Then, one evening, I noticed something strange on my security camera. The camera, mounted near the gate, showed Karen standing outside the entrance with a clipboard. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at the gate, jotting something down, and occasionally glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. It was odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was documenting something for the HOA. I figured it wasn't worth worrying about. That changed the following weekend. I was out back, clearing some brush near the tree line, when I heard voices. At first, I thought they were coming from the road, but when I walked closer to the fence, I saw two people, strangers, inside my property. They were walking along the edge of the field, pointing at things and chatting like they were on a guided tour. "Excuse me," I called out, walking toward them. They jumped, clearly startled, and started stammering apologies. One of them, a woman in her 40s, said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Karen said it would be fine. She told us you wouldn't mind if we took a quick walk around." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen said what?" "She said this was part of the neighborhood and that it's open to residents," the woman explained. "We just wanted to take a look." I was livid but managed to keep my cool. "This is private property," I said firmly. "Karen doesn't have any authority here. Please leave." They apologized again and hurried off, but I was left with more questions than answers. Why would Karen tell people my property was part of the neighborhood? Was this some kind of misunderstanding, or was she trying to pull something? The next day, I decided to confront her. I walked over to the HOA office in the neighborhood and asked to speak with Karen. She greeted me with her usual smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, nervousness maybe, when I mentioned the trespassers. "Oh, that must have been a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I might have mentioned your property in passing. but I never told anyone they could go in. I didn't buy it. Her tone was too dismissive, too rehearsed. But without proof, there wasn't much I could do, so I let it go. Before I left, though, she added, "You know, if you ever want to join the HOA, we'd be happy to have you. It would make things so much simpler for everyone." That's when I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Karen wasn't just nosy. She was trying to bring my property under HOA control, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. That week, I installed more security cameras around the property. If Karen or her HOA cronies were going to keep pushing, I wanted to be ready. Sure enough, the cameras caught her at the gate again a few nights later, taking more photos and scribbling notes. And then a letter arrived. It was from the HOA. The first line read, "We've noticed that your property is not currently in compliance with HOA guidelines." Compliance? I wasn't even part of the HOA. It started with an envelope on my doorstep. At first, I thought it was another HOA letter, so I nearly tossed it without opening it. But something about it felt off. There was no official HOA letterhead this time, just my name scrawled on the front. Inside was a single typed page. It read, "We, the members of Neighborhood Name HOA, respectfully request that you reconsider your stance on allowing limited community access to your property. Such access would greatly benefit the neighborhood, foster goodwill, and align with the aesthetic and recreational goals of the community." There was a signature at the bottom, Karen's, and below her name, a long list of other HOA members' names and signatures. This wasn't a letter, it was a petition. I'll admit, part of me laughed at the sheer audacity. My private property wasn't a public park, and I couldn't believe they thought a petition would convince me otherwise. But another part of me was pissed. This wasn't just Karen anymore. It seemed like she'd roped half the neighborhood into her crusade. I started asking myself questions. Why were they so obsessed with my property? What was Karen telling these people to get them to sign this thing? And what exactly did they mean by limited access? I decided it was time to get some answers. I went straight to Karen's house. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, she looked smug. "Oh, hi there," she said, in that same overly sweet tone she always used. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I held up the petition and said, "Care to explain this?" Karen glanced at it and shrugged. "Oh, that. It's just something a few of the neighbors wanted to do. No big deal." "No big deal?" I repeated. "You're trying to pressure me into opening my land to your neighborhood like it's some kind of public park. That's a big deal." Karen's smile faltered for the briefest second before she recovered. "It's not pressure," she said. "It's just encouragement. The neighborhood really admires your property, and we think it would be a wonderful addition to the community." "It's not part of the community," I shot back. "It's private property, and it's staying that way." Karen's smile disappeared completely this time. She crossed her arms and said, "Well, I'm just trying to be a good neighbor. But if that's how you feel, I guess there's nothing more to discuss." It was such a dismissive response that I almost walked away right then and there. But something about the way she said it, like she already had another plan in mind, made me hesitate. Instead of leaving, I decided to press her. "Why are you so interested in my property, Karen?" I asked. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. We're not. It's just, a lot of people feel like it would enhance the community. That's all." Her answer didn't sit right with me, but I knew I wasn't going to get anything else out of her. So I left. The next day, I started noticing weird things around my property. First, I found a pile of trash, cans, wrappers, even a pair of old shoes, dumped just inside the tree line. I thought maybe some kids had wandered onto the property and left it there, but the cameras didn't show anyone. Then, 2 days later, I noticed tire tracks near the back gate that hadn't been there before. Again, the cameras didn't show anything, but it was clear someone had driven back there. And then, the real kicker, one of my crops, a row of tomatoes I'd been growing, was completely trampled. At first, I thought maybe deer had gotten in, but there were no hoof prints, just flattened plants and dirt, like someone had walked straight through it. I was furious, but more than that, I was on edge. It felt like someone was trying to send a message, and I had a pretty good idea who it was. The final straw came a week later. I was walking the property, checking the perimeter, when I spotted something glinting in the dirt near the back fence. It was a piece of paper, wet and muddy, but still legible. It was another letter from the HOA. This one was different from the petition. It was an official notice, complete with letterhead and legal jargon, stating that my fence was in violation of community standards and encroaching on HOA land. The letter demanded that I remove the fence immediately or face further action. I couldn't believe it. Not only was my property not part of the HOA, but I'd checked the property lines when I first bought the place. My fence was well within my boundaries. I knew Karen had to be behind this, but now she was dragging the entire HOA into it. This wasn't just a petty power move anymore. It was a full-blown attack. I decided to fight back. First, I hired a surveyor to recheck the property lines. As expected, the results showed that my fence wasn't encroaching on anything. In fact, it revealed something even more interesting. A small strip of HOA landscaping, a row of bushes, and a decorative sign was actually on my property. Armed with this new information, I contacted a real estate attorney. He drafted a formal response to the HOA, demanding they cease all harassment immediately and remove their landscaping from my property. Meanwhile, I upgraded my security system. I added more cameras, installed motion-activated lights, and even put up a few no trespassing signs just to make things extra clear. For a few weeks, things were quiet. I didn't see Karen, and there were no new letters or strange incidents. I started to think maybe she'd finally backed off, but then, one night, I caught her on camera again. This time, she wasn't alone. She was with two other people, and they were standing just outside the gate, pointing and talking. One of them had a measuring tape, and the other was holding what looked like blueprints. The footage sent chills down my spine. What the hell was Karen planning now? It all started to unravel the next morning when I decided to call the HOA lawyer who'd sent me that ridiculous compliance violation letter. I wasn't expecting much, probably some vague legalese about community standards and misunderstandings. But what I got instead was the first real crack in Karen's plans. The lawyer sounded almost sheepish when I mentioned the letter. He stammered for a moment before finally admitting, "We were under the impression that your property was part of the HOA jurisdiction." "Under the impression?" I said, trying not to laugh. "You didn't even check?" "Well, Mrs. Karen, the HOA president, provided documentation suggesting that the property fell within HOA boundaries. If that's incorrect, we'd be happy to review." "Stop right there," I interrupted. "What documentation?" There was a long pause before he finally admitted, "She said there were plans to annex the property into the HOA. Annex. My property." I hung up and immediately called my attorney. This wasn't just Karen being nosy or overstepping her bounds. This was a deliberate attempt to claim my land as part of the HOA. But here's the kicker. Annexing property isn't something an HOA can just decide to do. It requires city approval, legal filings, and most importantly, the owner's consent, none of which Karen had. Fueled by equal parts rage and determination, I decided to dig deeper. I reached out to a friend who works in local government zoning and land use. Within hours, she sent me a file that nearly made my jaw drop. Apparently, Karen had submitted a request months ago to the city council to annex my property into the HOA, claiming it was unmaintained and beneficial to the community if it were managed under their rules. She had included photos of my farm, taken without my permission, and a list of complaints from supposed neighbors about my property being an eyesore and a nuisance. The lies were infuriating. My farm wasn't just well-maintained, it was thriving. And as for the complaints, I'd never heard a word from any neighbors, and based on the petition fiasco, it seemed like Karen was the one manufacturing problems. I knew I needed to act fast. Karen's request was set to be reviewed by the city council in just 2 weeks. If they approved it, I'd be dragged into HOA hell, forced to abide by their ridiculous rules, and potentially lose control of how I used my own land. So I did what Karen never expected. I went public. I started by printing copies of the surveyor's report that showed my fence was within my property lines, and, hilariously, how the HOA's landscaping was actually on my land. Then I added screenshots from my security cameras of Karen trespassing, taking photos, and bringing people onto my property without my permission. I even included a copy of her petition and a timeline of all the incidents, from the trespassers to the letter claiming violations. I posted everything online, tagging the local neighborhood groups, city council members, and even the HOA's own social media page. The title? The HOA president who tried to steal my farm. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors I'd never even met reached out to apologize for Karen's behavior, saying they had no idea she was pulling this kind of stunt. A few even told me they'd felt bullied into signing the petition, thinking it was just a formality. But the real fireworks started when Karen's own HOA board got wind of what was happening. Apparently, Karen had been keeping her plans quiet even from them, claiming she was handling a difficult neighbor situation. When they saw the evidence I'd posted, several board members immediately contacted me to distance themselves from her. One of them, a middle-aged guy named Dave, confided in me that Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for the lawyer and the landscaping near my property. She said it was for the betterment of the neighborhood, he told me, shaking his head. But now it looks like she was just trying to take over your land. With the HOA board turning against her and the city council bombarded with complaints from angry neighbors, Karen's empire was crumbling. But she wasn't done yet. The night before the council hearing, my cameras caught her again. This time she was trying to remove the no trespassing signs I'd posted. She had a pair of bolt cutters in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I called the sheriff immediately. When they arrived, Karen tried to play the victim, claiming she was just inspecting the property lines. But the deputies weren't buying it. They reviewed the camera footage, saw her trespassing, and slapped her with a citation. She looked absolutely furious as they escorted her off my land. The city council hearing was the final nail in the coffin. Armed with my evidence, my attorney and I presented a rock-solid case showing that Karen's annexation request was based on false claims and unauthorized actions. Several neighbors even showed up to speak on my behalf, condemning Karen's behavior and demanding accountability. The council unanimously voted to deny the request. Not only that, but they launched an investigation into Karen's conduct, especially her misuse of HOA funds. In the weeks that followed, Karen resigned as HOA president under mounting pressure from both the board and the neighborhood. Her lawyer dropped her as a client, and the landscaping she'd planted on my property was quietly removed. As for me, I finally got the peace and quiet I'd been hoping for when I moved to the farm. The HOA hasn't bothered me since, and I've made a few new friends among the neighbors who were just as fed up with Karen as I was.